As a Daoist mountain man, Fan Kuan has a truly unconventional reputation. We know very little about this artist, yet he has created the most majestic landscape painting of the early Song dynasty period. Everything about the Travelers by Streams and Mountains, possibly the only surviving work by Fan Kuan, is an orderly statement reflecting the artist's worldview. Fan Kuan's masterpiece is an example of Chinese landscape painting. Long before Western artists had even considered shifting to painting landscapes over figures, Chinese painters had already elevated landscapes as a subject of its own. Surrounded by mountain ranges and home to two great rivers, the Yellow and the Yangtze, China's natural landscape has played a large role in the shaping of the Chinese mind. Since early times, the Chinese viewed mountains as sacred and saw them as the home of immortals. During the Five Dynasties period in the early 10th century, an era of political upheaval between the fall of the Tang dynasty and the founding of the Song dynasty, scholars who fled to the mountains saw the tall pine trees as a representation of virtue. In the early northern Song dynasty that followed, pine trees and other symbolic elements were transformed into grand landscape-styled art. Fan Kuan painted a bold and straightforward example of Chinese landscape painting. After the long period of political disunity, Fan Kuan was one of the many poets and artists who turned away from the world to seek spiritual enlightenment. Through his painting Travelers by Streams and Mountains, Fan Kuan expressed man's harmonious existence in a vast but orderly universe. The Neo-Confucian search for absolute truth in nature as well as self-cultivation reached its climax in the 11th century and is demonstrated in this work. Fan Kuan's landscape shows the early northern Song monumental style of landscape painting. Nearly 7 feet in height, the hanging scroll composition presents universal creation in its entirety. Large boulders occupy the foreground and are presented to the viewer at eye level. Just beyond, we can see crisp, detailed brushstroke displaying the rocky outcroppings covered with trees. Looking closely, we can see 2 men driving a group of donkeys loaded with firewood and a temple partially hidden in the forest. In the background, a central peak rises from the mist-filled space and is flanked by 2 smaller peaks. This solid rock takes up nearly 2/3 of the picture. The sheer height of the central peak is brought to our attention through the waterfall plummeting from a crevice near the summit and disappearing into the narrow valley. The mountain form accurately captures the geological traits of southern Shanxi and northwestern Henan provinces. Plants and vegetation grows only at the top of the bare cliffs in the thick layers of fine-grained soil. To model the mountains, Fan Kuan used thickening and thinning contour strokes, texture dots, and ink wash. Strong, sharp brushstrokes depict the knotted trunks of the large trees, but Fan Kuan then uses detailed brushstroke to portray the greenery and the trees along the upper edges of the mountains and in the distance. The Neo-Confucian theory of observing things in the light of their own principles clearly resonates through this masterpiece. Northern Song landscape painters didn't paint what the human eye saw, but painted things in the light of their own principles. Through this, Fan Kuan was able to organize and present different aspects of a landscape within a single composition. Fan Kuan looked to nature and carefully studied the world around him. Through his artwork, he expressed his own response to nature. As Fan Kuan sought to describe the external truth of the universe visually, he discovered at the same time an internal psychological truth. The bold directness of Fan Kuan's painting style was thought to be a reflection of his open character. This grand image of the beauty and majesty of nature reflects Fan Kuan's humble awe and pride.